Welcome into the episode of Patrick Jones Baseball. This week on the podcast, we have Dr. Adam Maloof. So Dr. Maloof is a professor at Princeton University. We've had him on the podcast before, and he's phenomenal. So like I said, he's a professor at Princeton, but he also helps out with their baseball program. He's a former college baseball player himself. He's done a ton of research in college baseball and written a lot of different articles. And we talk about 3 specific articles that he wrote in today's episode: pitchers, hitters, and then catchers, specifically framing. I love talking to Dr. Maloof because, again, he's a scientist, and so he comes about this and views this from a different lens while also incorporating the human element into evaluating players and evaluating college baseball as a whole. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Dr. Adam Maloof. All right, we now welcome on to the podcast Dr. Adam Maloof. Dr. Maloof, thanks for coming on again.
Oh, yeah. It's a pleasure. Thanks, Patrick.
So this is your second time on the podcast. You know, last time we talked a lot about strike zone and some of the research you've done on the strike zone. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But you've put out recently, it seems like you've been on fire. You've been everywhere. You've been in Australia doing research for your job at Princeton. You've been writing research articles for college baseball and pitching, hitting, and catching as well. So you've been a very busy man these last few months. But I wanted to start out, if possible, maybe we could talk about the article you did on catchers and framing pitches, because I think it's something that's interesting. What was your hypothesis before you started doing the research on catcher framing if you don't know the exact strike zone? And then what were the surprises that you found from doing that research?
Yeah. So, the premise, can I take a few steps back a little bit? I'll just give you a little bit of the backstory. Okay. So, well, first of all, I was a catcher a million years ago. So I've always loved that part of the game, right? So that's my initial real bias. The second thing that happened recently that kind of made me think about it more were 2 things. One, what we talked about last time, the realization that the strike zone is so variable in D1. And so it made me think immediately, all the various stats, whether it's swing decision stats, whether it's zone percentage stats for a pitcher or catcher framing, what is the reference frame? What are we even comparing it to? Like, should we reward a hitter, a catcher, a pitcher for knowing their leagues, their conferences, their umpire strike zone? Or should we be grading them based on an MLB rectangle? So that was one thing that was just lingering in the back of my mind, not just for catchers, but for everything, based on this whole analysis of the strike zone. And then the other real thing was that Carl Hallgren, who now works for the Dodgers, he was a Drew University catcher, and he played and worked at Princeton for a year. And he was just an incredibly knowledgeable catching coach. And I watched him teaching our catchers how to frame. And, it's very different than when I learned how to frame, right? There's different motions, there's different approaches, there's different goals. And it just made me think this is a ripe time to think about catcher framing again. And I guess the third thing is simply, maybe 5, 7, 8 years ago, I can't remember, it's all a blur. But, there was that kind of rash of new MLB articles that came out pointing to the value of catcher framing. Like, every extra strike you get your staff is actually a huge deal. And I feel like there was a bit of a blitz where people were suddenly obsessed with framing and loving Jonathan Lucroy and stuff like this. And then we've kind of forgotten about it again. So anyways, all those 3 different things made me maybe want to get back to catcher framing. So I guess that was the motivation.
Yeah, so I was talking to a buddy of mine who coaches in college baseball the other day, and I sent him your article and kind of some of the things that you had found in the article. And one of the things that I thought was interesting that he said is he's like, I think that the automatic strike zone is for sure going to come at the major league level, but I think we're a long time away from getting that to be established at the college level. And so I think from a recruiting standpoint specifically, and by the way, if you disagree, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I hope we never get the automatic strike zone. I love the art of catching, but I think that the art of recruiting is something where I think I was like, is being able to throw as a catcher overrated? Based on the research now that you've done and some of the top catching people you've been around, do you think that there should be more of an emphasis on the receiving end versus the throwing end? Because the position is called catching.
Well, I mean, I am loath to say that the throwing part of the game is not important. But of course, I mean, and in college, admittedly, the running game is a much bigger deal than it is in Major League Baseball, right? I mean, people run amok on the bases, partly because the catchers can't throw and the fielding's unreliable. And honestly, in the Ivy, the thing I watch the most is that pitchers can't get it to the plate fast enough. So I'm not ready to tell you that throwing is not important, but I will definitely say that receiving is massively underrated. I just don't think people pay attention to it. I mean, like how many strikes that you can steal it from everything from the mental game, keeping think about how frustrating it is when a pitcher throws it, and it should be a strike and it's not. It's just everything from keeping your pitcher happy to getting all those extra strikes. I will say that I think that is massively, massively underrated. And I think it actually has a huge impact on the game.
So what would be some ways for coaches to be able to evaluate whether or not their catchers are doing a good job with that? Is it going to be completely subjective based upon whether or not they have TrackMan?
I mean, it's pretty tough to do without TrackMan. I think like if you don't have some way of measuring where the ball is going, it's like he said, she said kind of thing. I think it'd be, I mean, you might have qualitative opinions, but as I even highlight in that article, I think the eye can be pretty wrong sometimes. Like some of the catchers that these scouts are touting as the best receivers in D1 are barely above average, in my opinion. And so I think you need some kind of quantitative metric. I do think there's more to it than just TrackMan. So like one of the things that KJ Hallgren did that I think is great, and it's still so nascent, and it's not going to come to college anytime soon, is like we need to be tracking the catcher's glove in the same way that we're tracking the bat through the zone now. All these new metrics from Baseball Savant with bat speed and things, they're going to revolutionize the way we think about hitting. There's no reason why Hawkeye can't track a catcher glove. I'm sure it already can. It's a matter of a few computer vision people getting in with the data. TrackMan, maybe not so much. The camera's behind the plate. And so that's probably not coming to D1 baseball anytime soon. So in the absence of being able to kind of track the catcher's glove, here at Princeton, we were already starting to do that with high-speed cameras, but it's not in an in-game kind of thing.
Yeah. So when you say you're tracking it in game or with cameras, I assume obviously not in game per se. Maybe it is, but what are you looking for? Or like, how do you know if someone's doing a good job versus not a good job? Like, again, is it just subjective?
Well, two things here. First of all, I don't want to speak for KJ because he's the one who developed some of this idea of tracking the catcher glove. I'll tell you what I observed watching him do it, which was what inspired me to look at catcher framing, which is that, catchers these days are trained, right, to have their glove below the zone, so you can't really see it, but then they kind of bring it up to catch the ball as it moves through the zone, right? So really what you're looking at is how natural is that motion? Is it jerky? Are you accelerating at the right time? Are you catching the ball at the right spot? Are you fooling the umpire? And these things are very measurable. I mean, you can track how fast the catcher moves the glove from where to where. Like, where are they catching the ball? Are they catching it as their glove slows down, or are they catching it as their glove speeds up? Are they catching it as they angle into the zone, or are they catching it as they angle out of the zone? I would seriously, for all those that are listening, that are much more familiar with thinking about the swing of a bat, it's all the same stuff. Like, you want to track how quick the bat's through the zone. Are you taking an uppercut? Are you swinging down on the ball? Like, all these things, you could treat that as a catcher's glove. And I think they have a big impact on framing, probably even more so in D1 where the umpires are less experienced. I mean, you should see some of the strikes that these catchers steal in D1.
And that's D1. D2, D3, NAI, JUCO.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do you think, based upon all the research you've done in hitting, pitching, catching, we're specifically talking about receiving, is this you think the lowest hanging fruit out of all of them, the receiving part?
I think it's very, very low hanging fruit. Like, if you think about, like, again, I don't know much about recruiting. I'd actually be really interested to hear what you say about this. But like, if I'm recruiting a catcher, obviously you want someone that can hit. But to know how much you can earn in this game by getting, 5 extra strikes per game, both mental and in the score of the game, I'm setting out these catchers and looking at their TrackMan data from showcases. Like I'm making that part of a showcase even. Like it's not just their exit velocities. I'm looking, are they framing pitches? Are they stealing a few strikes? Because that is something that you can build on and is going to completely change the game. And it's not anything anyone else is doing, right? That's the definition of Moneyball. It's finding an advantage that someone else hasn't started. Everyone is looking at the same metrics now. No one is looking at catcher framing.
Well, they are now because you put this research out, and we're going to pause. Does anybody at Princeton? Does anybody on? Does like Joe at Princeton be like, dude, why are you going on podcasts? Doing all this, letting everybody know all our secrets.
Well, this is a constant discussion we have, and it's really. I mean, you hit on a very interesting subject, which is, my background is as a scientist. And we approach this kind of stuff in almost the opposite way that MLB does, right? Because progress in science is achieved through sharing. If you do your science in a vacuum, you never get anywhere. And in fact, you usually think you're further than you are before you find out that everyone else is doing it and 10 people are doing it better. And so it's really, really hard for me to want to be secretive. And there's still certain things we haven't talked about publicly as to keep as competitive advantages. But in the end, it's how well you use it. Right. And I want people to go out in there and say, you did this wrong, or have you thought about this? And it's so much better. That's why I'm so annoyed when I talk to MLB people, because they won't tell me anything. It's all so secret. And like, what are you guys doing for catcher framing or whatever the topic is? And I think they'd all be better off, believe it or not, if they shared a little bit, even though they'd lose the really easy competitive advantages that they think they have, but don't because everyone's doing it. And they'd actually forward the science and find little niches that they don't have now because no one's sharing. That's my opinion, but that's biased as a scientist.
Well, one of the interesting things that I found in your article was you had found that for every ball a catcher turns into a strike, it equates to 0.135 runs per game. I thought that was fascinating. And that's, now we're getting into some objective information when it comes to like how important receiving is.
Yeah. All right. Let me take not too deep a dive. Stop me if I get too technical, but a few things about that number that are really important. First of all, that's not my number. That number was for MLB. Okay. And that was from when that rush of information came out, I want to say between like 2018 and 2020 or 2017 and 2020. People looking at catcher framing, that was their estimate of how much, how many runs you saved. And that number, of course, varies. That's a mean because it all depends. Like, are you getting, a 2-strike? Is it a 2-strike count and you're stealing a strike versus is it 0-0? Right? So every count, you could think of it as saving a different number of runs. And actually, I'm working on, it's another article you can read that I wrote recently about whether you can trust win expectancies, which is basically what that whole article is about. But the problem with those stats, to give you the super overview, is that if you want to know how many runs you save from getting stealing a strike on an 0-2 count, the way you do that is it's a probability. You say, how many 0-2 counts were there in the history of D1 baseball? Then you look at whether the team that stole the strike on the 0-2 count won. And you compare that to every game that ever happened. And you say, look, when this specific sequence of events happens, the team is like 0.1% more likely to win. Right? That's how all that works. That's how win expectancy, run expectancy, all those are based on studying the history and building these kind of probabilities. And the problem is when you lift the curtain on those stats that people you've seen the win probability charts, as the game goes, it goes like this. It just looks like a nice curve. It turns out the uncertainties on it are gigantic, right? Like if you're in the third inning, you steal a strike on an 0-2 count with 1 out and man on second. How many times does a team win or lose? Like if you look at how that game ends, there's 1,000 games that look like that. Some end with one team winning 10-0. Another one lose with the team losing 10-0, right? The variability is huge. And so, yes, you can take the mean, but on a game-to-game basis, that mean tells you nothing. That mean might tell you something over the course of a season, if you're lucky. Anyway, so that I'm sorry that got technical, but the short answer is that number, I've quoted it simply because it's so large, right? It's insane. You steal 10 strikes and you steal a run. I mean, that is insane. That's so much more valuable than throwing a guy out at second. But it's not my number, and there's actually a lot of uncertainty. That's all I'll say.
Okay, yeah, no. I'm glad you broke that whole thing down right there. So based upon everything that you just said, there's a lot of uncertainties. Like how, if you're going to simplify everything, like when it comes to how like being able to quantify stealing a strike and how what that could mean for a team in terms of runs, things like that. Like what would it, not necessarily like give me a specific number, but like how should coaches be thinking about the value? You said right there, like if stealing 10 strikes could equate to one run. I mean, is that accurate?
I think so. I think that's the right order of magnitude.
Okay.
I think the way you'd get into trouble if you started talking like one strike at a time. If you start saying like, oh, we just stole a strike, then that's an extra 0.12 runs for this game. Steal a few more and we're going to win. Like that is not the right way to think about it. If on the other hand, you say, I'm choosing between these two catchers, one of them, has an OPS that's 20 points higher than the other, but the other one is going to steal 30 more strikes. That's the right order of magnitude to compare these two. I'm taking the guy who's stealing the strikes nonstop. It's going to have a much bigger impact on the game. And of course, can we do better? I think more research needs to be done in college to evaluate exactly where that balance is. Like, there's no reason we couldn't put a number on, like, what is a catcher framing plus metric 10% better? How does that equate in terms of OPS? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
There's no reason why, we could get there. That's just a couple more steps from what we have. Yes, there'll be uncertainties, but I think the short answer from that paper is simply that we're really underestimating the impact of catcher framing. And I think that 0.1 runs per stolen strike is not a bad start to think of it roughly.
Gotcha. Okay. I like talking to someone like yourself, Adam, because you have experience in baseball. Like you said, you played college baseball and you're doing research in baseball, but you don't have a dog in the fight in the sense of like your job isn't on the line, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like you're not going to get fired if, somebody doesn't like the research you do or anything like that when it comes to baseball. And I say all that from specifically, we'll talk from a recruiting standpoint. Like if you have like a couple players and one from a throw is like really good throwing, like has like a 1.9, 2.0 pop time consistently in the game, and maybe the other one has a 2.2 or 2.3 consistently in the game, but the 2.2, 2.3 one is a little bit better from a framing standpoint. Based upon the research that you've done, is it no doubt you should get the guy who's a 2.2, 2.3 because he's significantly better framing?
Yes. So I'll answer that in two ways. My first reaction is definitely yes. I would definitely take the framer. Part of that is that from my own observations, I would argue that in D1, the most runners are stealing on the pitcher, not the catcher, right? The how slow pitchers are to the plate is astonishing. And even if you've got a catcher that's got the 2.1 or 2.0, like if their pitcher isn't quick to the plate, people are going to steal on them all day. So I would say, if I were ranking that order, I would say if you want to control the base running game, I'd work on the pitchers first, then the catchers. And then if I was choosing the catcher, the other part of this equation, right, is which can you coach? And that's the problem because no one's coaching catcher framing. And it's not that easy to coach arm strength. I mean, the pitchers are getting it, but not a lot of catchers are in arm programs. Right. And so like if your program is confident, like our pitching coach is amazing. If you're going to have him work with the catchers, I'd say take the framer all day because he's going to teach them how to throw. Alternatively, if you've got, KJ Hallgren or a catching guru on your staff who can really teach framing, first of all, I'd first check that they actually can teach framing because no one's measuring it. So you don't know if they're doing well teaching it or not. But anyways, if you feel like your program knows how to teach framing, like nothing about these skills are unlearnable is what I would say. So, it's not a one-stop shop. But yeah, I would say if you just said you have an average program, you're not really coaching framing, you don't really have an arm program for the catchers, what would I choose? I would take the framer.
Mm. Yeah, it would be nice to have people on each staff from Joe Hamacher, for example, is your guys' pitching coach. He does a phenomenal job and is really, really good. Like you said, I mean, that's obviously a competitive advantage for you guys. I think the arm action from a catching standpoint, arm action in general, I think, especially from position players, very hard to change. That's one of the things that I see. Like once you're in high school, like you don't see a whole lot of position players being able to change their arm action. It is what it is. So I could understand that. I mean, footwork, things like that, you could, I mean, obviously, like you said, like anything else you could work on. But you would think that the receiving part would be the easiest to train. But to your point, Adam, like nobody is actually doing the research or actually like understanding like whether or not they are training it or if they're doing a good job or not because nobody's tracking it. So it's easy to say, but it is still subjective.
Yeah, I would liken it to like in terms of I'm really speaking off the cuff here now because I've never tried to teach someone how to frame. But like to me, it's probably somewhat similar to teaching a shortstop to turn the double play, right? Like it's footwork, it's handwork, it's soft hands, it's transfer, it's glove movement at the right time, those kind of things. And I kind of agree with you. In theory, it seems imminently coachable. But, it's really hard to coach with the eye test. And so like you really got to be you've got to be working with video, with data and trying to see like, is this working? Is this, like, are you stealing strikes? I think it's that part is hard enough. Not teaching the actions are hard, but quantifying whether it's working is the hard part.
So let's say I drop you off, Adam, at just some random program. They have TrackMan, but they don't know what else to do. Like what would be the first things that you would do in order to start implementing something like that to be able to track it?
Well, that in some ways that part's the easy part, the tracking. If you have someone like me or anyone, like all it is a matter of setting up a baseline, right? You can look at all their previous games and say, what did they do? When were they stealing strikes? When were they not? Are they having trouble with the off-speed pitch? Are they having trouble when it's inside to righties? You mapping out those patterns. If they've caught enough games, like you set up that baseline, no problem, right? Then there's the coaching step, which is what do you do? And then the tracking step, if you're just doing in-game, like the next season, it's very easy. What KJ and stuff like that are trying to do, which I think is harder, but imminently doable, is do it in practice, right? That's where you can set up your video camera and say, okay, before your average speed to the reception was whatever, 30 miles an hour. And now you've moved it up to 35 and it's smoother. I'm not seeing any accelerations, right? So then you're measuring that movement and that part's better. How it translates in a game though, you don't know until they've played another game, right? So I think the way I would set up a program is you build your baseline, then you track both in practice and in game. Then you actually learn how to coach in the process because you say, what was I coaching in practice that led to what outcomes actually translates to the game? And then before you know it, you've got an incredible catcher framing program. Stealing strikes left and right. When I did that analysis, there's certain schools who show up that have multiple catchers, in the top 50. And I'm just thinking to myself, I wonder what they're doing.
Well, I think wasn't Coastal Carolina? Was Coastal one? What were the schools off the top of my head? I thought Coastal. They had two guys who were top draft.
I thought Coastal only. Well, Coastal has Bodine, who is like the one who was scouted as the top framer. I think he was probably drafted more for his hit tool than his framing. To me, he was like an average framer. But like, the school that stood out to me actually was Oakland University. They had two framers. One didn't quite qualify. He had cut too few games, so he's not on the board anymore. But like it was just a few hundred pitches short. But they had two. If you included them both, they were both two in the top 10. So either like they've got weird umps, or they're teaching their catchers how to frame.
And we need to take a trip up to Oakland University of Michigan and see what's going on.
And anyways, there are a few others. I'd have to pull up the leaderboard, but like whenever I saw two framers on the list, I thought, okay, they're doing something, or the catchers are helping each other. All it takes is one person to know what they're doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so that's the catch. Oh, again, by the way, for all those who are either watching this on YouTube or listening to the podcast, all of these links to all three of these articles are in the show notes. So you'd be able to just click them and be able to go right to them so you can read all of them, because Adam does a phenomenal job. I mean, very in depth. So if you're someone who wants to know every single detail of what we're talking about with each article, like he goes 10x further in the actual research, which is awesome. I think it's great. When I was reading the article you wrote about hitters, the first thing that popped to my mind when I scrolled down immediately when I was reading it, and I saw JOPS plus, and I was like, I don't even know if I've even heard of that one before. What are some of the, first of all, what is that for those who don't know? And then like, what were the biggest takeaways from that article?
Okay. So this will highlight our philosophy here at Princeton specifically, right? And JOPS, we pronounce it JOPS. It's actually named after Joe Hallmacher.
And, oh my God.
And here's the idea. Where I'm watching from a distance what MLB is doing. And it feels to me that every new stat is more and more complicated. You know, whether it's WOBA or FIP or, you know, there's all these stats that are coming out that have just, think of them as a lot of weights, like this number of times home runs, this number times this, and this number times this, right? And this is very dangerous. Like as a scientist, we avoid that like the plague. We only do it when we have no other choice, because every time you add another weight to another variable, you're overfitting the data. And so I'll try to make that, we might have even talked about this briefly last time, but I'm really into this concept that for any science, whether it's baseball or not, what we are trying to do is balance fit and fitness. Fit is how well your model fit the historical data. Fitness is how well you can predict the future based on your model. I think there's way too much emphasis on fit. Every time we add a new coefficient, a new weight, a new variable, a new this to add, we're going to always increase the fit by definition. I could even add random noise and I would increase the fit. Like that's just math. And so that's not always the right thing to do. Adding another coefficient has to massively increase the fit to make it worthwhile. And the fitness, meaning if I only had data from 2024 and I want to predict 2025 based on certain observations, turns out often the models with the best fit do actually worse in fitness. They do worse predicting. So JOPS was our attempt at finding the simplest possible variable. There's only one coefficient, one weight in the whole thing to explain runs scored from a batting perspective. In other words, if you want to take batters, you have everything they've ever done, walks, strikeouts, singles, exit velocity, all this stuff. What best predicts how many runs they score for the team, like runs generated? Turns out you just need to multiply on base percentage by roughly 3 and add slugging. So it's like an OPS version where you're just waiting on base percentage more. In D1, getting on base matters a lot more than your slugging percentage. Once you're on base, things go crazy. And so I think that's the way to think about it. JOPS was our stat. It's very similar to OPS, but it does a remarkable job predicting behavior. Like it actually does better than WOBA.
Well, and first of all, why does Joe Hallmacher get the credit for Joe OPS? Like, why is his name in there? It should be Adam OPS.
No, it was his idea.
It was his idea for the hitters?
Yeah. So like he came from it from a totally different perspective. Here he is. He's got his pitchers and he wants to know like which hitters do we need to worry about? What simple stat best tells him about the hitters that they need to pay most attention to? Again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but one of the things Joe really focuses on is that, our pitching staff is not good enough to hope that they're going to strike everyone out. We need to get in and out of innings. We need to keep pitch counts down. We need to keep our starters in the game for more than 4 innings. And so you can't pitch to every corner throwing your highest fast velocity fastball every time because you're going to be out of the game. You're going to throw too many pitches. As part of that strategy, he needed a simple metric to evaluate hitters. And so he kind of did the same exercise I did. I just, did it with fancier math. But he had already figured out that OBP was more important than slugging. That in an OPS framework, OPS didn't do that well in D1 at predicting runs scored, but that if he increased the weight on base percentage, basically he figured out pitchers need to keep guys off base. And that was it. And so, yeah, it was all his idea. And then I just made it fancier. So it's called JOPS.
I love it. No, I love it. I what I do like about you, Adam, is you don't take any of the credit. You're like you are every time we've talked, had you on the podcast, you're giving credit away to everybody else. I love that about you. That's interesting. I was talking to. It sounds like like what he was saying. It's about keeping runners off base, which makes sense. I was talking to a coach the other day, and he was saying that they're actually okay with walking with their pitchers walking guys because defense is not very good in D1 college baseball, and so they don't want to have pitchers who are constantly having the hitters put the ball in play because their defense is really good. They'd rather recruit to guys who will strike out a lot, but also they walk a lot too, and they're fine with that because of how poor the defense is across college baseball.
I couldn't disagree more. I think that's insane. I think once you get on base, defense still matters. That's the thing is in MLB, I would completely reverse what they said. I would say in MLB, you can afford to walk people because double plays are a virtual guarantee if you have a ground ball. Whereas in D1, it's a crapshoot, maybe a 30% chance you're going to turn the double play. I mean, maybe the SEC is different, but in Ivy League, you get a guy on first, he's going to steal second or get to second on an error, almost guaranteed. I can highlight this. I'll try to make this not technical, but here's an example of how extreme that effect is. Remember we were talking about this whole win expectancy thing where you're using all the probabilities. So when they do that in MLB, all the calculations, they take what's called the base out state, how many outs there are and who's on base. And when they do these calculations, they take it from the beginning of a plate appearance, meaning you're up to bat, there's man on second, there's nobody out. Whatever you do to change the game is based on that original state. I found out trying to do this for D1, you couldn't do that because when the batter got up, if there was a man on base, they were never at the same place as they were when they started. By the time the plate appearance ended, they had advanced or gotten out, right? It's just mayhem on the bases. And so I couldn't disagree more. I think walks are probably the bane of college baseball. There's a walk in college baseball is almost 3 times more valuable than it is in MLB. That's what JOPS tells you. Yeah. And that's
3 times.
3 times.
Wow.
And that's just simple math. That is showing you how well does this statistic predict runs scored? And it's telling you that in college baseball, walks are 3 times more valuable than they are in MLB.
Now, does that take into account what type of stadium that they play in, whether it's the ball just dies in the air, doesn't go anywhere, or if the pitcher is more of a fly ball pitcher versus more of a 2-seam ground ball pitcher?
Yes. So the way we take into account that is when we call it X-JOPS, right? And so X-JOPS, that just stands for an expected stat. What we do there...
I thought that was going to be somebody's name.
But what we do there, and you got to stop me if I start to get too technical, but again, this becomes a game of probability. So here's what happens. We take every single hit that has ever happened since we had TrackMan, 2022. Hundreds of thousands of hits across D1. And we say, for this, you have 3 measurements: exit velocity, launch angle, and spray direction. Taking those 3 variables, what is to just pick a triplet. Let's say we took an exit velocity of 100 miles an hour, launch angle of 20 degrees, and a spray angle to left field, roughly. Yeah. Then we say, okay, how many of those there were? Let's say there were 500. How many were outs, singles, doubles, triples, and homers? Right? So we have a distribution of outcomes for that triplet. We also have an average JOPS. We can calculate what a hitter's average JOPS is for that exit velocity, launch angle, and direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We call that an expected stat. That's where MLB stops. They just take the averages. What we actually do when we calculate X-JOPS, so when you look at those leaderboards, did you notice they were error bars?
Yeah.
Right. So the way we calculate that error bar is that I actually will simulate the season for a player 500 times. So a player gets up, his first plate appearance, he hits a ball with that triplet, exit velocity 20 miles an hour, launch angle, blah, blah, blah. And I say, okay, if I look at the 500 plate appearances that ended with that data, there are 100 singles, 200 outs, 100 doubles, something like that. And so what I do is I actually roll the dice 500 times and I randomly draw from those probabilities. So if there was a 50% chance of a double, I might still roll 5 singles in a row. But if I roll 500 dice, half of them are going to be doubles. But I do that for every one of their plate appearances. So like I have a trajectory of JOPS for every possible season they could have had just based on how they actually hit the ball, not based on what stadium they're in or, who's playing and so on and so forth. And so that's the way we try to see through some of those defense and stadium effects. Obviously, it doesn't see through every, like if they're a really fast base runner, they're going to beat out more hits and so on and so forth. But that gets much closer to what you're saying. Like JOPS, here's the way to say it. JOPS is how they actually did. XJOPS is how they should have done.
Interesting. Okay. I gotcha. That's interesting. Yeah. This is going to be one of those episodes I'm going to go back and re-listen to it again. And I'll probably come up with some more ideas and questions.
Yeah.
This is great though, man. I just, again, I love, because there's not a lot of people in this space who are putting out research like this in college baseball specifically. I'm sure you see stuff in Major League Baseball, of course, but not in college. So that's why I love that you're doing it. And then you also, and this is maybe like the bread and butter, you did a research article on pitching as well. Did Joe help out with that at all, or is that just you?
Well, yeah, no. Well, the pitcher leaderboard one, that was just, I just threw that together, but it's based on all the ideas from, working with Joe. And so like, there's an equivalent single stat that we came up with, that we call total bases per innings pitched. It's also insanely simple. So it's like WHIP, but instead of just adding up walks and hits, it's adding up the total bases that you give up per inning. And that's the most powerful statistic for predicting pitchers' success. So, and we also can do XTBIP, right? XTBIP is the expected total bases per innings pitched using that probabilistic model. And by the way, that probabilistic model I described to you that can do these X stats, that's the Hit or Not app that I told you about. I think you may have tried that, but like that's the thing that works essentially like hit tracks. Like you can be in the batting cage and type in the observed exit velocity launch angle. It'll tell you how well that does in every MLB stadium and D1.
Yeah, actually, I don't think I told you this off the air, but I'm not actually working with really any hitters anymore. So when you sent that to me, I have not been in the cage working with the hitter since then. Even though this in the cage, yeah. But I will. I'm going to get that to a couple of buddies of mine because I'm just doing recruiting full time now. So I will get that couple of buddies of mine who will do it. But there was in the article I highlighted something I wanted to read. You said my sense from talking to a variety of sources is that sometimes a pitching prospect's velocity, body shape, and athleticism drive their placement on draft boards as much as their performance. And I 100% agree with you when it comes, especially like the body shape, the athleticism, like how they look. That's the biggest thing that I see in recruiting in general is the eye test from like, oh, like that player looks a certain way. Like I'm more attracted to them, almost like dating, versus someone who maybe doesn't look the part, but maybe has some of these tools that you're talking about, like where the receiving or maybe pitchers, it's deceptive. So it's kind of like a Brent Suter, somebody like that, who was another Ivy League guy. And so I think I like how you put that in there. You made sure to put that in there because that is something to keep in mind of like, we really do have to come from an objective standpoint when it comes to evaluating players and not let our biases of how someone looks take a role into that because it's very easy to let that happen. I think it's probably normal for humans to let that happen too. But anyway, I not to ramble, but I thought I was glad you put that in there.
Well, it's interesting because I think that's a really nuanced subject because I didn't put that in to necessarily disparage teams for doing that because the reality is some of their biases are actually good biases. They may find that without even having numbers to put behind it, that a certain body shape is less likely to get injured or more likely to build out into someone who can throw 3 pitches for strikes. I have no idea, right? Like some of those biases are founded in reality. some aren't. And so, like, certainly if I had access to 100 years of scouting reports in the MLB, I'm assuming teams are doing this, I would be trying to sort out which biases are valuable, which ones aren't, right? You could look through and say every time a scout said, you know, thick, thick ass, or, whatever it is. That was the example from Blindside for football. But like anytime a scout said that, did it pan out? Which of those kind of physical biases are actually valuable ones to stick to because they are based on experience, but which ones are really not valuable and are making some bad decisions. So I didn't mean to say that it should only be about performance. I was saying that mostly because I realized no one's probably going to listen to me anyways. And mine are strictly performance. I don't even know what half these guys look like because I'm not watching them or scouting them, right? So it's, I don't want to argue that my metrics should be the only things that.
No. Yeah. And maybe I said that wrong. I wasn't trying to say that you were saying that. Maybe I was my own opinion. I was kind of tagging that along because I do see that a lot where it's like, oh, he looks the part of this or that. And it's like, at the end of the day, like, do they play? Can they play? Yeah. And that's the thing. I think in college baseball specifically, Major League Baseball is different. I mean, it really is a completely different game. College baseball, it's about winning games now. So like I care less about how someone looks and more like, do they help me win games right now?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, what you just said actually relates back to the strike zone conversation. Let me just bring up this point, which I think is one that coaches, recruiters, all these people really need to think about, which is that, so many of the tools that people would use on like True Media or so on and so forth, these are tools that are more designed for like a showcase or for MLB. They're not designed to win games in college. And so like, if you're not recruiting just to have someone on stage so that they can get drafted, if you're recruiting to win as many college ball games as you can, I actually think a lot of these things need to drastically change because that's not how the infrastructure is designed. I think people like the catcher framing thing or like just knowing the strike zone. Like if you're recruiting to someone who does well with a major league strike zone, you're not taking advantage of the fact that you have a weird asymmetric big strike zone in D1. You're completely missing the boat. And so on. And so like, yeah, I think that you highlight a really important point that there's kind of recruiting as a stage for MLB versus recruiting to win college games is actually pretty different.
Yeah. So, okay. So coming at this from a scientist standpoint, literally in yourself, love the fact that you're someone who's just, you don't put all the stock in just the data and the research. Like you're like, there's some anecdotes out there too that could be useful as well. So what would be some of the things what are some of the things that you think are specifically overrated?
I mean, that now it's a tough one to answer because I don't really feel like I'm in that game. I mean, I hear a little bit about recruiting from our coaches, but I've never been a recruiter. Like, you mean in college? That college?
Yeah. Like in college, like you said, you feel like a lot of the stuff on True Media, a lot of the stuff that maybe they're evaluating when it comes to players, like that. If it's about winning games now, a lot of it's not relevant.
Yeah. Okay. So I can give you some examples. Yeah. No, I'll give you some examples of that. Like, I think velocity on both sides of the baseball is a perfect example. Like, if you're a pitcher, maybe you can hit 95, or whatever, higher. But if you can't throw, 2 strikes in the strike zone, you're not going to be successful. And yes, maybe you're a hitter and you've got huge, natural power when you make contact. But like, if you're not making contact, again, D1 is about getting on base. And so, I think it's very easy to be attracted to the guy who has this potential to hit 20 home runs, when in fact, most of the time you'd be better off with getting the on base guy, which is not going to pass the eye test, like a team full of Dustin Pedroias or something. So yes, I would argue that some of those I lump them perhaps over negatively as like showcase metrics, as opposed to metrics that correlate with runs scored in D1 baseball.
I think the 60-yard dash is another one. It's like,
yeah,
I don't think I move the needle.
That's right. Can you get a good jump? Are you actually reading the ball off the bat in the outfield? We have all the time, our fastest guys are not necessarily the best fielders, let alone base stealers.
I think what's challenging from a recruiting standpoint is MLB, you have scouting departments. Time is on your side from a scouting standpoint. Whereas in college, time's not on your side when it comes to recruiting and scouting players because you only have it's just you and a couple other coaches on a staff, and you have to see, all these different players across the country or wherever you're at in general. And it's tough because in order to see some of the things we're talking about when it comes to getting on base and swing decisions, like you need to see somebody a long time to be able to know that. Maybe at times you don't, but when you don't have that much time, you do have to make decisions, yes or no decisions, very quickly. And I think one of the coaches told me this not a few years ago when I first started doing recruiting. He's like, we're trying to eliminate players more than we are trying to like get players that we think are going to be a fit here. We're just trying to eliminate players.
I don't think that's a bad approach. That's a very scientific approach. Like if you think about the scientific method, all we try to do is eliminate hypotheses. It's actually fairly effective because you can never be totally confident you found the right guy. It's a lot easier to be confident that you found some wrong guys that you can, that you can delete from the list. So I don't think that's necessarily bad, but I totally agree with you that you don't have time on your side. I see our coaches trying to recruit. I mean, many of these guys they see once.
Yeah, that's it.
And
Now, Ivy League's definitely different because you're going after a certain individual that is so specific and is just top of the food chain when it comes to multiple things, academics, athletics, things like that. So that is really like they're very, very specific, and you have to honestly recruit probably across the nation for that. But I would say by and large, the average program out there might be a little bit different. I'm going to throw another question on you is, what would be, if I know you don't have any experience recruiting, but you do have experience playing baseball and you watch baseball and obviously you're helping out with Princeton. Like what would be some of the things that you would do? Or you mentioned how it was scientific to be eliminating players more than anything else. Like are there any things that pop into your mind that from a science point of view, you would do from a recruiting standpoint?
Okay, so a couple things, but again, I don't feel like I have a particularly good answer to this. So for one, I definitely think, despite being the data person, that, for most high school players, the data are so limited, especially if you're just seeing them in a showcase environment, that I honestly think it's barely valuable. I'm not really sure what you can do with it. If they happen to play in a summer league or something that has TrackMan from every game, you actually could start to measure things like swing decision, and you'd want to do so, in the context of the strike zone and so on, so you could do that really well. But just say the average high school kid, you don't have enough data for that to be useful. So honestly, I'm falling back on some of the qualitative things, like how do they interact with their teammates? Are they leaders? Are they winning games? Not just hitting hard, line drive outs or whatever. Like it's these intangibles to see. I'd want to see them in games, not showcases, and see. Yeah, I think that's the intangible. And one way we're trying to address this at Princeton, without giving too much away, is we're kind of in the same way that I'm assuming and hoping MLB teams are doing this with their scouting departments, but we're kind of going back through the archives and saying which players did we not accept, which did we accept that didn't come here, and which did we accept that came here, and then measure all their performance while they played in the Ivy League.
Yeah,
and try to look for those patterns. Because the coaches have notes on this, like amazing leader, but slow 60-yard dash, like stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then maybe we're going to be like, oh my God, we should have taken that, guys.
So are you leading that?
No, I would say ultimately this is, Joe and KB, our two assistant coaches who are doing all the recruiting. And we have a student that I'm trying to help basically collect their data. I mean, I'm helping on the data end. Like, what do we do with this massive notebook observations?
Yeah, like is this just an Excel spreadsheet from all the notes that they put in, and they just take an Excel spreadsheet and organizing it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the first step. But then there's a matter of grouping it. And like, how do we detect, again, without getting too technical too fast, but like, are there certain words that are associated with success and not? Like, are there certain things that, whether you call it your bias or your eye test or whatever it is, are there certain things you say that actually equate to a very high success rate or a very low success rate? Like noticing that a guy isn't friends with his teammates. Does it turn out that that's a huge indicator of whether they're going to succeed in college? And then we tell the coaches, keep that. Make that like a box you have to check. Always say, do they work well with their teammates or not? you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I consider it a co-evolution. And we start with this giant mess of non-systematic but really insightful notes. Try to figure out what's most important in it. Feed that back to the coaches and say, here's how you can make your notes more systematic so that you always have the information we need on every guy you see. And then it goes back and forth like that.
Are you using are you guys using AI for that?
Well, yes. I would say we're not far enough along to really tell you if that part's working yet. But yeah, in the form of detecting word associations and things like that. So like an early example of this, we published a paper on this. So this is not letting any cat out of the bag, but we actually used large language models to convert high school play-by-play. High school had no data, but they still have play-by-play. And we converted that using LLMs into spray charts. So like we can take any high school player and actually make a spray chart for you from their whole season or their whole career in high school, even though we never once had a TrackMan measurement or anything like that, just from words in like newspaper articles.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And so that's that kind of approach that's only getting easier as the LLMs get more powerful.
Any predictions you have going forward? Like anything that maybe just stuff that you're curious about that maybe you'll be doing some research on in the future, or maybe you're not doing research on, but you have a prediction on something when it comes to college baseball in general, or what people evaluate or anything.
Oh, man. It's really hard for me to feel like I can predict anything outside of Princeton, because I can tell you that, I'm writing those articles out of enjoyment. It's mostly an echo chamber. Like, you're like the only one who, says anything. Like, I read your article. Let's talk about it. So I have no idea if they're having any impact. And I don't know really what other people are doing. Because like you said, there's almost nothing written about college baseball. So that feels like an echo chamber. And it's really hard to know, A, what other teams are doing, and B, whether any of the things we're doing are going to catch on or go. So it's really, I don't really have any. I can make a lot of predictions for how I think we're going to go in Princeton.
Yeah. Let's talk about that, because that's a great point, because you could give everybody all the answers and it may take them 5 years to actually listen to these answers. That's why I'm kind of like you, where it's like anything I've ever known about recruiting or hitting or the mental game or whatever, I just throw it all out on social media, because I'm not worried about someone else taking and stealing it. And if they do, great, that's going to just help out more players. But by and large, I know most people aren't going to actually take it and do anything with it.
Exactly. That's how I feel pretty much exactly the same. And I hope that someone will eventually disagree. I keep waiting for that person to email me and say, you did this wrong, or consider this. Actually, we did get that once. It was fantastic. So I had this student, Bryce, who wrote the outfield, the outs above average statistic. We have now an outfield model for D1. Basically measuring catch probabilities. And there was one step in it that I'd say we did a less good job than we could have. And Tom Tango, the famous, MLB statistician, actually made a comment and gave us good advice, and we improved it. And now it's an even better model. So I wish there was way more of that, for people engaging and so on. And then we'd get better fast. But yeah, for now it's an echo chamber.
One more thing I wanted to just bounce off of you is, and this is something that I think about in general. I think this is like a society issue, but it's information, and it's having too many choices. And I wonder if part of recruiting in college baseball, or just college baseball in general, scouting, is there's coaches have too much information. There's too many choices out there. And because they have all this information, because of all these choices, they don't actually, they aren't efficient, and they don't necessarily always make the best decisions because they're so bombarded, versus the guys are like, we know there's all this chaos going on out there, but we're just going to focus on doing this one thing. We're going to do it better than everybody else. We're only going to pick players from this specific area or these organizations or whatever it is. And honestly, they probably just are happier people, and they probably win more games because they're doing deep work, which I think I'm sure you've heard of Cal Newport and his book, Deep Work, and the importance of not task switching all the time and things like that. I think there's a role in that as well, but maybe I'm crazy. I'm just thinking about that. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, what you just described is a version of what we talked about with JOPS. I mean, if you were to describe a statistic as distracted or focused, complicated or not, like that's like JOPS. Like we're not getting distracted by the 5 million stats out there. We're saying, listen, we've done the quote deep work to know that this one is the single best predictor of how many runs this guy's going to score for us. That just makes our life so much easier. We look at people's JOPSs. And of course, there's more to it. We don't want to just look at that. Like they might be a total jerk or whatever. But like these simple stats are meant to simplify life. Make it, and it's simpler for everyone. It's not just the coach, it's even the player. Like if a player, I see our players all the time, they're overwhelmed by all these different stats. If we say,
and
this
those kids
is the
go to
stat,
Princeton.
yeah, exactly. If instead we say, this is the one stat that's actually going to most effectively predict your success, focus on this, like get on base more, do whatever. It just helps. So I couldn't agree more. I think like it happens in my life all the time. It's easy to overcomplicate things, get stressed, try to multitask too much. You only ever do everything worse. Focus, try to simplify, recognize that you're giving something up in the complexity of life by making, whether it's your statistic or your life decision, simpler. But if you've done the deep work to know that it's effective, it's going to make your life so much better. That's how I feel. And when you ask like some of my goals and progressions, like there's certain things we haven't found simple stats for. And like, I keep looking for them, like how can we make this simpler? Why do we have to resort to this complex model? Like, is there a way to think about this in a simple way? And I think there often is. It just takes work.
Beautiful. Adam, appreciate you so much for coming on again. I love all the research and all the articles. We're gonna put them all out on the show notes page. If someone wants to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, just email me. I think that Medium page has my email, but it's just Maloof at Princeton. It's not hard to find me. If they look up my name, they'll find some weird pictures probably, and then I'm happy to take emails. I think that's the best way, and I would love that kind of engagement. I love if people ask questions. And hopefully point out some flaws. I want to improve it.
All right. Well, yeah, everyone heard it. Let's get some flaws out. Let's try to pick some holes in it. But Adam, thanks again for coming on, man. Ton of fun.
Thank you, Patrick. It was a great time.